Please welcome Chip Roy. Thank you for making the trouble and the time to be here.
No, not at all.
Thanks a lot. Everybody had traffic problems today.
Oh, man.
It's okay. This is
Austin, Texas.
Austin, Texas. You can never tell what's going to happen. So you were not in Houston last night.
I was not in Houston last night.
Why do you hate America?
I was making the 21st district great again.
Great again. Were you?
I was here. I had events, scheduled here in the district, so that's where I was.
Right. Why do you want to be in Congress? Most people, when they run for the first time, have not had the opportunity to see the sausage being made. They don't know better. You do. So having seen the sausage being made, what makes you want to be in there?
I'm not sure want to be in Congress is the right phrasing. I feel called to be in Congress, which is a slightly different thing.
Yeah.
And that's an important distinction. I think right now we're at a critical juncture for our country. You know, some of the folks watching or here today know that I'm a cancer survivor.
Right.
7 years ago, I think last week, I was declared cancer-free at MD Anderson after having gone through treatment there. And I kind of came out of the other end of that. I was at that point kind of done with public service. I had worked. I've been a federal prosecutor, U.S. Attorney's Office. I'd worked for Senator Cornyn, for Governor Perry. And after almost a decade in public service at that point, I thought, now it's time to go take care of my family and get out in the private sector, which is where I started my career in banking and working in the private sector. But, after spending a few months not knowing how that was going to go, coming out the other end, I felt a new commitment to public service and wanting to, the way I put it, save the republic for my kids, right? The famous quote from Franklin, a republic if you can keep it. So that's what motivates me, and I believe right now we need Congress to work for us. I don't think Congress is working for us right now. I think Congress is getting caught in its own trap, and that it gets caught in its own messaging and thinking inside the beltway, inside the bubble. And they're not doing what they say they will do whenever they run for office.
So the rumors of Washington being broken are true?
Well, I wrote a few lines along with my friend Governor Rick Perry in the book Fed Up, right? We were working together on that book, and the first chapter was called America is Great, Washington is Broken. I believed that in 2010, 2011 when we were working together, and I believe that now. I think some of that is changing, not necessarily because of Trump or any one thing. I think it's been changing for a while, whether it was Mike Lee getting elected instead of Bob Bennett, Rand Paul instead of Trey Grayson, Marco Rubio instead of Charlie Crist in Florida, Ted Cruz instead of David Dewhurst, the establishment of the Freedom Caucus, the election of Trump. There's a wave of change. People saying that the status quo in Washington needs to change.
Yeah. I'm interested in hearing you say that America is great, Washington is broken. So we don't need to make America great again because America is already great. This has become more than just a rhetorical flourish over the last 2 years. I mean, are we trying to fix something that's broken more broadly with America?
I don't believe so. I mean, look, I still adhere to the way Governor Perry put it when we were working together. I do think America's great, Washington is broken. But look, if Washington's in the way of America's greatness, then America is not as great as it should be, right? In other words...
So it's really make America more great.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the way I think about it, right? But I believe Texas is the best example of that. If you see the economic growth, if you see the opportunity, you see what happens here in Texas when people are unleashed. You know my philosophy. And whether you or any listener listening to this buys into that philosophy or not, my philosophy is that America does best when it is unshackled from government.
Right.
When people are free to achieve and to succeed based on their own merits and based on investment in capital and business growth and development. I believe that greatness is clearly exemplified where you see it when government is not as engaged in interfering with us.
So the Washington that's broken, I can't help but notice, is right now run by your party. Right, the critique of Washington and the critique of Congress specifically is not implicitly but explicitly a critique of your party.
And I'm totally fine with that. I might change the phrasing of your party and change it to the party.
Well, you
that
are
I'm
running
under.
as a Republican.
That's right.
It is Republicans in power. I don't know how it's not your party.
It's the party that I'm associating with and running. But when you say it's your
well, you could have run as an independent.
Well, you could. But look, I'm a proud Republican when I look at the Democratic Party as the alternative, and they're not even in the zip code.
It's a choice, not a referendum. I get that.
And so my standpoint is the Republican Party isn't doing what it said it would do. The Republican Party has done a lot of really good things with respect to taxes, with respect to judges, with respect to the president's efforts on the regulatory state, but we are still miles away from where we need to go on border security, on healthcare freedom, on making sure we balance the budget and quit talking out of both sides of our mouths when we talk about spending restraint.
Yeah.
You know, it's one thing to get a tax cut passed to try to create the economic growth to grow us out of debt. That's important.
Yeah.
That's step one. But step two should be right there alongside it, not behind it, right alongside of it, and that's spending restraint, and we're not doing it.
Right. So if Paul Ryan were not retiring and he were running for Speaker again, and you were elected to this Congress, the Congress coming up, you would be a vote for or against Speaker Ryan?
I would have to look at that, you know, if I was put in place of it, but I don't.
I mean, we ask Democrats about Nancy Pelosi all the time.
Sure.
I think it's only fair to ask you about leadership on your side.
Yeah, no, it's fair. I think that's a hypothetical. It's obviously not in front of me. I think Speaker Ryan has done a number of very good things, and I think Speaker Ryan has not accomplished some of the things that we ought to have accomplished.
Right.
I would look at that and say, right now, if I were looking at it today, I would think we need a new direction overall, and would believe that we need a change in leadership broadly. Right. I really do believe
this
that.
Is the Freedom Caucus, again, I use the word critique.
Sure.
This is the Freedom Caucus critique of the existing Republican leadership.
Sure, but again, keep in mind that, you know, you've got to get to 218 votes, right? And so you have to find a way to work together. I've got a lot of great friends in the Freedom Caucus and the Democratic side of the aisle, great friends in what you might call the Republican establishment. You find a way to get to 218. So I'm not interested necessarily in, you know, going in sort of saying, you know, guns ablazes, like, okay, well, so-and-so is you know, failing in X, Y, Z. What I am interested in is holding the line and saying, guys, let's take, for example, this summer. I very strongly disagree with the way leadership approached immigration this summer. They put up 2 votes on 2 bills related to immigration. Only did one of them because they were forced to by the Freedom Caucus on the question on the Farm Bill, right? Yeah. They held their Farm Bill vote in order to get a vote on a, what I would call a stronger immigration bill. That bill had strong strong border security, strong immigration reforms, which would have been more merit-based and points-based instead of focused so much on chain migration and diversity visas. And it did include, by the way, a compromise in the eyes of the Freedom Caucus, some opposed it, a status for some dreamers.
Right.
That bill had 193 votes, not a single Democrat, 193 votes. What did the other bill have? Weaker on security, a little weaker on the immigration reforms, and a path to citizenship for 5 million. We don't have to debate the intricacies of the bill to suggest to you that would be a softer view a softer bill in the eyes of those who want to see strong border security. That bill was whipped by leadership. They asked the president to support it, and it got 121 votes. That's my point. We had a bill that had 193 votes. It was 25 votes shy.
You think their leadership should have gone harder on that?
Well, I think you start with the principled bill that you want to start with, and then you build to 218. They did the same thing with Obamacare. Last year, a bill was basically created behind closed doors, dropped on the floor of the House, and said, take it or leave it. We've figured it out. That's not how the process works.
And we talked about it at the time, and I remember you were opposed to that bill. You actually joined people on the left who opposed that bill, but for completely different reasons. They thought it was too harsh. You thought it wasn't, in essence, harsh enough.
It's not, well, that's a phrasing that I would take issues with on the health care front.
Well, you don't think that the repeal went far enough?
Correct. Yeah, but that's an important way of putting it.
Right.
And it's interesting that you say that about sort of siding and having strange bedfellows, right? I think you hosted an event with the lady from...
And it was Ann Dunkelberg from the Center for Public Policy Priorities who came at this believing Obamacare was working, we ought to retain this. Ovik Roy, who is seen by some as a conservative thinker on healthcare, said, no, I think this is a good deal, we ought to support it. But you were actually to the other side of Ovik Roy and saying, this doesn't go far enough, we should not support it.
Right, and my position on that, if we're going to go down the road of healthcare reform, is just simply that if you don't do the thing that's going to cause costs to go down, prices to go down, then it won't work. I didn't believe that the bill last year would do that.
A bad bill is not better than no bill in that case.
Well, what it means is that if you're going to own something, a bill like that is now going to, in my view, not address the core problem, then you own that. Now, and here's the interesting point. You talked about strange bedfellows there. That's not the first time in my career that that's been the case. In 2003, 4, 5, 6, there was a big debate going on in Washington on asbestos. You might remember that. And Texas had passed what we called the medical criteria bill in Texas. Very, very transformational in terms of what it meant for stopping the gross violations that were being perpetrated by trial lawyers and enriching themselves on the back of sick people in this state. And the medical criteria bill stopped that fraudulent B-reader problem that was going on, where you just had these people in mills being churned through. The sick were being prohibited from getting their day in court and really getting the dollars they should get, and lawyers were getting enriched. We solved that problem. Now sick people are getting what they needed. We made sure that only sick people were getting it. But Washington came along in all of its infinite wisdom, led by Arlen Specter, Republican, the National Association of Manufacturers, and a bunch of other people that had sort of all of their fingers in the, in the pie. And they wanted this big asbestos trust fund. Would have cost $300 billion for taxpayers. I fought that alongside John Cornyn, fought to stop it. Now, who were the strange bedfellows? Some Democrats who didn't want to see the bill get done. We didn't want to see that bill get done. We wanted to protect Texas and Texas's medical criteria approach. I think that was the right policy choice. And my point is, I'm happy to work with anybody towards the principles that we want to try to get accomplished.
Right, but of course, it is technically true that your bedfellows on the asbestos bill. It's technically true that your bedfellows on the health care bill, but you don't agree with the principles that lead you to oppose the bill. You may be united in your opposition, but you have almost nothing else in common.
Well, we have in common the desire to have people have high quality health care. We might have the same goal of
the
making
destination
sure
is the same, but the journey is so different.
That's right. But look, I believe in freedom. I believe in allowing people the ability to go out in the case of health care and get access to the doctor of their choice in an open market where you have direct primary care, where you're going straight to your doctor. I believe in health savings accounts. I believe in health sharing organizations and ministries where you can
believe
in
protecting pre-existing conditions.
I believe in getting rid of an environment that is causing people with pre-existing conditions to not have options.
To not be insured.
That's the problem. In other words, Republicans view all of this through the lens of the politics of polling, and they're running away from the whole point of pre-existing conditions. And instead of challenging that and saying the pre-existing condition problem, such as it is, which is roughly about 7% of the overall market if you look at the numbers, this problem such as it is created by government, created by regulations, created by an environment where costs are now so high that people can't afford to have insurance and keep it themselves. And more important than not being able to afford insurance, they can't afford the health care. And you change that model massively if you get to the place where, like, why are we in the system we're in? It's because government regulation in the wake of World War II, when we froze wages, created an environment where employers started providing health care coverage. Then you started getting this strange dynamic where your insurance is now wed to your employment.
Right.
So woe to you if you change your job.
Right.
You're now stuck trying to figure out what to do.
In fact, a lot of people don't change their jobs for fear that they're not going to have insurance.
And that's why the system is so broken. And we need to break the back of that and make it to where, just like your life insurance, your automobile insurance, your homeowner's insurance, it's your insurance.
But you may say, Mr. Roy, in your case, in your specific case, you may say, I don't oppose the idea of people having access to health care with pre-existing conditions. I just oppose the system that provides it now.
Correct.
But Democrats will say he simply wants to throw out the current system which does provide it, and the idea of being able to create a system that gives people that kind of coverage or that kind of access is an abstract. Well, so you'll have a Democrat, perhaps your Democratic opponent in this race, campaign against you saying he doesn't care about people with pre-existing conditions, and they'll point out that you are someone with a pre-existing condition.
Correct. I mean, one of the things that always, sort of, what is a pre-existing condition? I'm now, thanks to the good Lord and prayer and medicine and MD Anderson, 7 years removed. I'm now closer to the statistical norm. So really,
should you lose this race and have to go seek employment in the private sector and get insurance, your survivor status would not qualify nonetheless as a pre-existing condition for insurance purposes?
I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, what I understand from a lot of people that I've talked to is like, no, once you get past the 5-year mark, you're not in that, pre-existing condition category. But regardless, the point is this: I mean, it either is or it isn't. That's the whole point of a market. You don't know until you go out in the market and see, right? I don't know how much a car is going to cost, or what. I mean, ask me. I don't know how much an F-150 costs right now.
Right, but you understand we're talking about the principle, whether people with pre-existing conditions ought to have access to health care.
But here's the question: of course they should. We should all have access to whatever we can get in this great, big, beautiful market, right? For all of the basic necessities of life, food, shelter, clothing, right? We allow there to be options, robust options throughout our society to provide what we need to go get in the marketplace. And with respect to healthcare, the whole question here of playing on the field of insurance and taking the insurance system, the healthcare system, turning it upside down because we're trying to figure out how to solve the problem for 7% of the population. That 7% was created on the back of a broken regulated system. You'll remember in that debate that we were talking about, the lady said, man, in the wild, wild west before Obamacare. And I think you might remember, I kind of turned my head and looked up and said, what do you mean the wild, wild west before Obamacare? right? We didn't have a wild, wild west of competition in markets and creativity and innovation going on in 2008 because it was already highly regulated through UMRA and HIPAA and EMTALA and the rest of the alphabet soup that comes out of Washington, limiting the ideas and the innovation that you can get at the market and in the state level. And to be clear, the last thing I want to say on this is we have infinite number of options and ways to try to solve this problem. Right. Not all of those roads go through Medicare for all, which would 100% bankrupt our current government as well as our healthcare system. You have high risk pools. You have ways that you can be insured and then have insurance against being uninsured. There are lots of great studies on this. There are so many ways to do that. But in my view, you want to create cost pressure to get prices down, and that's the fundamental lens through which I drew health.
I want to go back to the process piece of this, the piece about Congress and the relationship between Congress and the White House for a minute, but I want to just do one last thing on healthcare, and then I want to come back around to issues. You know, Texas continues to be the state with the most people without health insurance in the country. We started out with 6 million before the Affordable Care Act. I think it went down to 4.6. It may have crept back up a little bit now. On a percentage basis and on a raw number of citizens basis, we still lead the state in the number of people without health insurance. Should that be a concern?
Of course, but again, what is the primary concern? How much is it costing you to go down and get health care? When you have an illness, when you have a problem, or when before that, in terms of having preventative care, what is your ability to access affordable health care? Right now, Obamacare has caused premiums to do what? Go from $200 and something in the private market to $500 and something in the private market. You have 35 to 40% of counties across America that have zero insurer or one private insurer in the private market. You have situations where, the cost of health care has been going up now for decades, right? This isn't a new problem.
Right.
Since I was born, and I saw a chart, since 1972, the number of doctors have gone up about 100%. They've about doubled. In that same time, administrators have gone up 3,000%. That's part of the problem of our healthcare system. We are basically having the government, and we're having regulations, and we're having an environment where all of that is feeding the beast and causing all of those costs to go up.
Are you prepared to say that we should get rid of the current system without having an alternative in place?
What is the current system? I am prepared to say that we should undo the regulatory morass that is shackling the ability for Americans and Texans through innovation to create the opportunities for doctors to provide care. Talk to the hundreds, thousands of doctors that I've been talking to who say, I want an environment where I can just go provide care without, by the way, insurance companies subsidized to the tune of billions of dollars in Washington, getting continued to be subsidized from Washington, so that you can pick up the phone and call and have some 25-year-old on the other end who's not a doctor, doesn't know anything about healthcare, tell you that your MRI costs $3,500 when you know you could go down the street and get an MRI for $300. But they're looking at some schedule that's in place because they're trying to make up money because they can't get their Medicare reimbursement rates or because they've got subsidy and rules that are in place. And don't get started on drug costs, but it's all of that is in the same bubble.
Right. All right, go back to Congress. We got off onto healthcare. I want to come back around to the question of Congress. You've committed that if you are elected to Congress, you will be part of the Freedom Caucus. You intend to be that. And you have said, I mean, I asked you about the Paul Ryan thing as a hypothetical. Let me ask you about a non-hypothetical. You have said that you support Congressman Jim Jordan from Ohio for Speaker. You think he has a chance of being Speaker? I mean, we're looking at Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise, two members of the current Republican leadership. You're looking potentially at the chair of the Freedom Caucus, Mark Meadows. You're looking at Patrick McHenry from North Carolina. All have been mentioned. In some ways, Congressman Jordan seems the least likely of that group to the untrained outside eye of being Speaker. Why is he the right guy to be Speaker? And why is being part of that Freedom Caucus environment the right thing for you to do?
Number one, Jim Jordan put his name in the ring, and that counts for something, right? He did that early, and he did it in order to create an alternative and to change the conversation. Jim's running on the narrative that we should do what we said we would do. I agree with that. Yeah. That's where I find fault with the existing leadership regime. But to be clear, I think that it's important for us all to figure out through that process, like any other group, right? I mean, what is a speaker's race, whether it's in the United States government or in the Congress or whether it's here in Texas? Right. It's essentially like a class leadership election, right? A high school election, student government or something, where you're choosing it internally. We're going to have a lot of discussions and a lot of debate over that. But what I want is I want someone who is going to present a plan for how they're going to accomplish the things that I think that the people of the 21st Congressional District, the people of Texas, and I think people broadly across America want to see occur. They want sanity again in government, and they want to have government get out of their way so they can be free. We want to see national debt going down. We want to see a balanced budget. We want to see healthcare freedom. We want to be able to get the doctors.
Are you not satisfied that all the people I mentioned who are potential candidates for Speaker feel the same way about that?
I don't know that history necessarily gives us an indication that everybody feels the same way about that. Take the immigration bills that went down to the floor of the House this year.
Right. You put some of that at least at McCarthy and Scalise's feet, having been in leadership. They have to own the failure of that exercise.
Well, what they have to do is present what they want to do in the future. And they've got to make sure, like past his prologue and all that, but the main thing is that they need to present their options. They need to present their vision. I want to see someone with a commitment. I don't want to have leadership do what they did, which is put forward a bill that does not solve the problem, didn't have a chance of passage, then get the president to support that bill and work hard to do it and get 121 votes in the process.
Could you support McCarthy and Scalise in the end, potentially, if you ruled out the possibility of supporting them?
Right now, I'm focused on supporting Jim, and we'll have those debates, and we'll do that as a conference, and then we'll see where we are as we move forward. I want to see leaders, whoever they are, stand up and give us a vision for where they want to take the country. And by the way, I don't want anybody to hide behind Senate rules and procedure or hide behind what they say they can't get done. I want to hear people say what they can get done. There is no reason, for example, on health care, why Republicans in Congress should not have just simply passed a strong health care repeal bill and sent it over to the Senate and said, make the Senate vote. Make the Senate figure out how it's going to handle dealing with the Senate rules and procedures. Don't hide behind it over on the House side. Same thing with immigration. Say, well, they can't get to 60 in the Senate. You know how many times I've heard that in my career? Well, we don't have 51. Well, we don't have 60. The next thing I'm going to hear is like, we don't have 101.
Right, but Mr. Roy, process does matter. As a practical matter, it is impossible for the Senate to do exactly what the House does because the Senate is different, the makeup of the Senate is different, the rules are different. I mean, you can't completely disprocess or the political realities of the other body.
Only in Washington, or maybe in the media circles, is the realm of the possible defined ahead of time with some random constraints that nobody in America gives a rip about. In other words, who is sitting in Omaha, Nebraska today, or here in Austin, Texas, or Dallas, or anywhere else saying, man, those cloture rules.
More people than you'd think these days, actually, I have to tell you.
Well,
there are many fewer civilians on this stuff today.
But my point is just the art of the possible, right? I mean, you go talk to innovators, go talk to the business.
So do you believe
on both sides of the aisle, by the way?
Yeah. Do you believe Mitch McConnell has been part of the problem as far as that goes?
Look,
you called out the Senate. I'm asking you to own your calling out of the Senate. Do you think Mitch McConnell's part of the problem?
Number one, the Senate never got a bill from the House, I would argue, that then put them having to vote on it, right? In other words, send over full repeal with all of the things that we know we want in it, and then message it to the American people. Explain why you think that's good for them, why you think that's going to create an environment where their costs are going to go down, they can keep their insurance, etc. Fight the fight where you're arguing something that's going to win minds and hearts. And then when you send it over there, look, what are they afraid of with respect to voting? Do you remember a time when we would be sitting there and watching the United States Senate and there'd be robust debates and there would be votes and there'd be a lot of votes on amendments and you'd have to come home and own the vote? Name me a time in recent memory where there's been a significant number of votes that you could go look at the members in either the House or the Senate and say, man, they sat there and they had to go through these votes and have a debate on those bills. It doesn't happen that way right now.
Do you think it's a protection racket?
It's a power protection racket. And they go behind doors and they cook a bill and then they drop it down and they've figured out all the levers, right? Well, if we do this, we'll protect so-and-so in Pennsylvania and so-and-so in this part of Texas or California. Instead of saying, look, the Voting Rights Act was on the floor of the United States Senate for what, 3-4 months straight? That was a hard bill to pass. Imagine trying to get Southern Democrats in 1965 to pass the Voting Rights Act. That's a lot harder to do than is today to figure out how to get immigration and health care.
You understand, this is the Chip Roy that they're afraid of, right? The Tim Alberta interview that posted this morning with Politico says that the Republican leadership is concerned that you're going to be to the right of the Freedom Caucus. I didn't think there was a right of the Freedom Caucus. They're concerned that you're going to come in and say exactly what you said and that you're going to completely blow the place up.
Well, I don't buy into this notion of whether I'm to the right of the Freedom Caucus or to the left of where I am.
But you understand what you're saying is scary to some people there who are more institutionalists.
But what are they scared of? Right? I'm not sure who's scared of anything. I know a lot of these guys, and I don't think they're. I think the press likes to put labels on some of us and create these kind of fake skirmishes.
Stipulated.
But hey, we got made news here today. No, but look, you know, the reality is this. I believe strongly that you win minds and hearts when you put something out for debate and then you go out and you articulate your case for it. I have not heard Congress do that in as long as I can remember, with an exception. What was that exception recently? Standing up in defense of the confirmation process and Brett Kavanaugh, wherever one even falls on that debate. My point is you suddenly had 50 senators who found a little bit of steel to put in their spine and stand up and fight on what was clearly a contentious and difficult issue. And my point is, I want to see that on spending. Yeah. I want to see that on health care.
Well, and as you point out, those folks are going to have to come up and defend that vote. That's what they're doing right now in this election.
And that's okay.
Right. I asked you about McCarthy and Scalise and whether you could get around to supporting them eventually, and you said, let's sort of see what happens.
Right.
I know that at least in one very key case, you changed your position on somebody, and that's on the president. You were not a fan of the president, at least as you articulated your views of him during the campaign. And you came around to a place now where, at least as I understand it, while you don't agree with everything he says or everything he does, you generally support the president and believe he's doing a good job.
I do think that the president is doing a good job, and I generally support what the administration is doing. What I would suggest to you, that not unlike the way my previous boss, Governor Perry, or my previous boss, Senator Cruz, characterized their differences with the president, you might remember some of their choice words about the president.
I think Governor Perry said that President Trump was a cancer on conservatism.
And there were
Senator Cruz said worse.
There were lots of different phrases. Look, that's politics. Right. It's like the president said last night in Houston. That's politics. And I view things through the lens of put your faith not in princes. It is a biblical psalm or proverb. Someone get me on that one. I think it's important. And Donald Trump is going to come and go. Ted Cruz is going to come and go. I don't even know if I'm going to get elected. We'll see what the voters of Texas 21 do.
Elected officials are transitional. Principles are permanent.
Principles are permanent. And we put our faith in God and we put our faith in principles. And so what are the principles being articulated right now? Right now, over the last 20 months, regardless of style, regardless of tweets, regardless of statements, I think that the president has been leading us forward in a way that empowers people, that maximizes freedom, puts more money in people's pockets, gives us judges that interpret the Constitution according to the rule of law, gets regulations out of the way, undoes the Clean Power Plan, undoes the so-called Paris Agreement, and gets us in an environment where we can create wealth, create jobs, create opportunity, drive the world forward. And in the process, we've been having a robust discussion on some very difficult issues like immigration and health care.
Yeah.
And I just want leadership in Congress to stand up and go along and send it in the right direction where we need to go.
If Ted Cruz had won that presidential election instead of Donald Trump, on the substantive piece of where we've seen these 20 months go, would the world be different?
Of course the world would be different. I'm not sure in what way, significantly, and I don't know that I'd want to hazard a guess. I think principally speaking, I think that Senator Cruz would have wanted to go down a lot of the same directions in terms of tax policy, in terms of regulations, in terms of judges.
There'd be similarities.
So there'd be a lot of similarities, and I think that was why they were the two remaining candidates.
Stylistically, though, as you say,
there'd be clear differences.
There'd be very big differences. I mean, I know you a little bit off stage to be a person of kind of high moral bearing and faith, and I just think about you temperamentally, from a personality standpoint, and I think about the guy in the White House, and I think you all are not alike.
But that's okay, right? I mean, nobody is all alike.
You don't have to like him or necessarily agree with him from a style standpoint to support generally the principles being upheld.
Sure, and to be clear, I don't know him, right? I mean, too often we make these things personal in politics when we don't even know people, right? So there are stylistic differences.
Do you think we don't know him?
Well, I've only met him once.
But do you think that we as Americans don't know him at this point?
Well, what we know is what we see in the sort of public persona, right? I've talked to a lot of people that say that is a very different persona than what you get when you're behind closed doors, but that's almost academic. I mean, the point here really is that, and to your point, is I fundamentally believe that we are driven by what we want to achieve and accomplish for the American people.
Right.
And so, again, personalities come and go. I can have strong disagreements with leadership in my own party,
right,
with leadership on the other side of the aisle, but some of my best friends are on the other side of the aisle, and I'm happy to work with them. Will Hurd likes to point out that 800 and something bills were passed last year on a bipartisan basis. Now, I would joke around with Will, and we have our own differences to say, well, I'm not sure I'd trumpet that as a good thing. I'm not sure 800 bills coming out of Washington just on the back of an envelope is something I would tout.
It's the passing part, not the bipartisan part, that's the problem.
Right, I mean, exactly. My point is that I've got lots of friends that I've worked with on lots of different issues, copyright, fixing the Wright Amendment and flights coming in and out of Dallas, things that happen every single day. And I do believe that there's a lot more that binds us than separates us. But we're clearly at a fever pitch right now. And I believe, as you've heard me say, that is because we've got too many things coming from Washington with a top-down approach. And I believe we unite our country by celebrating our differences and agreeing to disagree. Let California be California, let Texas be Texas. And then we can reunite under our core shared values, having a strong country.
And those differences without regard to party. In other words, you will support Democrats where you agree, but also oppose. With this president, you will support him in areas where he agrees, but you won't be a rubber stamp for everything he wants to do.
Absolutely, and that's critically important in a world in which people in Congress have forgotten that Article 1 was given them by the founders as Article 1 for a reason, and that Congress is supposed to represent the people. And that Congress is supposed to be not just a check on the executive branch and judiciary, but they're Article 1. They're supposed to drive the ship.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about check on some of the things that are happening now and the things that you've believed in, upheld as principles for many years, and where there may be some difference with what is actually happening in Washington. I thought that you all cared about deficits. I thought you all cared about debts. Here's you to Tim Alberta in the Politico thing this morning. This is the party, you're talking about the Republican Party, this is the party that 6 years ago was campaigning against the president saying we need fiscal responsibility, we need to reduce deficits. What is the deficit going to be at the end of this year, Mr. Roy?
Well, we're going to hit $1 trillion deficit in the next fiscal year. And
but
we're
what
going
is
to have
the
22 trillion in debt.
22 trillion in deficit.
We're heading towards, anyway.
Haven't we just done exactly what you all campaigned against in the last presidential election and complained about for the previous 8 years, which is run up deficits? Wasn't that a bad thing? Now suddenly it's not a bad thing?
The answer to your question is yes. That is what Republicans have done. They would probably all agree it's a bad thing, but they don't have the fortitude currently to do anything about it. Too often in Washington, they get in the trap of, we got to get something done. And for the sake of it, they leave out the processes and the principles you put in place to do it the right way. What are they doing right now? They're hiding behind the men and women in uniform to provide greater resources for them that they believed were lacking under the previous administration, to then plus up and continue to just spend without any restraint. And that, I believe, is fundamentally
You believe that's
flawed.
the reason that the deficits have gone up because of spending?
I believe that it's because of spending. I believe that we have a spending problem and not a revenue problem.
So the economic analysis
history
that
largely
says that,
bears that out.
Yeah, the economic analysis of the tax cut bill that passed that shows that the deficits have gone up, at least in part because of the tax cuts. You're not buying that?
Look, revenue is up. Revenue is up post-tax cuts. The question here is simply, do you believe that the federal government has enough money, $3.5 trillion-ish a year? I mean, it gives or take a couple $100 billion. I mean, only in Washington can you round a couple $100 billion. But, $3.5 trillion or so, give or take, of revenue. Do you believe that that is enough money to carry out the core constitutional function of what the federal government is supposed to do? I do believe that. I believe that if you want to balance the budget, you start with the roughly $1 trillion that it would take to fund our men and women in uniform and secure the border, which I believe is a part of our national security. And do that, then go over and say, well, we've got obligations under Medicare and Social Security. Let's honor our commitments to those who are relying on it. There are plenty of retirees who are relying on that money. Let's honor that. All right, now what's left? Well, let's make sure that we've got this and this and this and the FAA and whatever we need to operate.
But when you're out of money, you're out of money.
And when you're out of money, you're out of money. That's how
you run your household
budget at home. That's what the Texas Tribune has to do when you go out and seek dollars from donors. That's what,
let's not get into that.
Well, okay. But you have to function and you have to manage debt or you go out of business.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Anybody does, right.
And then the same thing with everybody in this room, the same thing with the state of Texas. Now, does that have to be done in year one in such a way that is disruptive for everybody? I would say no, although I don't know that that would be a bad thing, by the way, to cause that conversation. But should it be done in 5 years?
You think we should have a plan to get our deficits down?
Here's what I think. I think Congress ought to come in session in January, and I don't believe they should leave Washington, D.C. If I were a leader right now, I would call a roll call vote every day in Washington. Nobody would leave town until we passed a 5-year balanced budget and we appropriated to that budget on a straight line basis. Why do I say that? Because they'll pass a 10-year balanced budget. It won't balance until year 10, and then the next year they'll pass a new 10-year balanced budget.
We'll take it out another
10.
year. But what do you do to get that 21 trillion in deficits or 22 trillion in deficits down? I hear Leader McConnell say the other day, kind of, more in sadness than in anger, more in resignation, well, we're going to need to look at entitlement reform. The fact that the deficits are up, we're going to need to look at entitlement reform, when it wasn't entitlements or entitlements alone that caused the growth of the budget or caused the deficits. There were a lot of other things, including, again, back to the economic analysis, in part, this tax cut.
Right. Well,
is that the right path to go down? Should we be looking at entitlements as the way to get the deficits down?
I mean, yes, and yes, or no, depending on how you're asking the questions. Yes, we must deal with entitlements, but keep in mind, last year, February, so a mere 18 months ago, the White House sent a 5-year balanced budget up to Congress that balanced, per the president's request, in 5 years without touching Medicare. They did. It would have balanced in 5 years. What did Congress do? They laughed it back down the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue and said, we're not going to touch that because Congress is not serious about spending. So, okay.
And this gets back to your criticism of both Democrats and Republicans.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
And what I would say right now is that if you look at the path of balanced budget, today it's getting closer on your ability to do that because we're getting closer to the 8 years from now when Medicare is out of money. And we've got a real problem there. So now costs are continuing to mount with entitlements. Now just merely cutting the spending outside of Medicare and Medicaid makes it even tougher. So what I think we need to do is figure out how to reform Medicare, Social Security going forward. I think we ought to block grant Medicaid to the states with dollars that would then provide a lot more money. We could save $4 to $5 billion on Medicaid in Texas and use that money for high-risk pools and to improve health care, save money in Washington, and then get busy reforming Medicare and Social Security. There are a lot of ways to do that, but you've got to have the vision of saying, we're going to set an objective and we're going to go achieve it. And that's if you want to get my fundamental problem with leadership, frankly on both sides of the aisle, is that they're not being visionary and saying to the American people, we know how hard it is to do this. We know how hard it is to figure out how to say, we're going to balance the budget in 5 years, or we're going to get healthcare freedom and solve the healthcare or immigration.
But that's what you sent us to do.
But that's what you sent us to do, and go do it. By the way, I would never suggest, as I'm sure my opponent would say is true about me, that there isn't room for compromise anywhere in that process. But my view is start with the principle, set out the post, say I'm going to go there, and then let's all work together to achieve that.
Let me ask you about a couple more issues before we open up for questions. This issue of the migrant caravan that has been, it's sort of the yellow Volkswagen of issues. We didn't see one and then we saw one every day, right? We can't stop hearing about the migrant caravan 14 days before the election. The president, every time he talks about the caravan, blames Democrats. This is because of Democrats, because Democrats won't pass immigration legislation. That is why we have the caravan. I mean, leaving aside the fact that there's a Republican majority Congress, and if the Republicans got on the same page and wanted to pass immigration legislation, as you point out, they could. Is this a legitimate issue to be concerned about?
Of course it's a legitimate issue to be concerned about. Immigration and border security broadly.
But I mean the caravan, caravan specifically.
Sure, but they're not unrelated, Evan. I mean, we have this situation for a reason. If you're serious about border security, if you're serious about national sovereignty, and let me just be very clear, if you're serious about your so-called compassion with respect to immigrants, then you would take very seriously securing the border and doing it the right way and sending the right message to the world. We have children getting sold into the sex trafficking business by the powerful cartels on our border. You go talk to border security, border patrol agents at the border and ask them who has operational control of our border. Is it the most powerful nation the world has ever known? Or is it cartels? It's cartels. And now these children are getting used. A child today, a beautiful little girl today, is going to end up in the sex trade in significant part, not wholly, but in significant part because we refuse to do our job as a nation. You have children riding on the top of train cars. You have mothers dying in deserts. I get sick and tired of people believing that they've got some sort of, ownership over compassion in the name of open borders, when I believe that is the exact opposite of compassion. What should we do in this case? I'm not sure. This is a tough question. We need to follow our laws. Our laws aren't great, by the way. They're a mess because they're a patchwork quilt of legislation, consent decrees that were worked out with judges, a judicial order that then impacts what you do with children at the border. All of that is now a mess. And by the way, Mexico hasn't agreed with us to be I can't remember what you call it, but it's like the third party, the third country.
But you've actually you've said, at least in one case, what you think we ought to do, and that is you are for the wall.
Yes, but that is one piece of a very large puzzle, right? I am for fencing or a wall to the extent that you want to call it that. But what I'm for is operational control of the border. Because let's take the wall. What happens? It becomes this whole big debate about the wall. But what is that really? What is that? It's a metaphor for security at the border. We need to start down in the valley, and we need to start working up the border and just make sure we've got operational control. That will be fencing and walls in some place. But Evan, go sit with the Border Patrol down in Laredo. Go visit with them. Of the 72-mile sector of the Laredo border, how many miles do you think has not a fence or a wall, but even a road that allows you to navigate the Rio Grande if you're a Border Patrol agent? 2 miles of 72 miles. That's impossible. They'll tell me they're down there at night at 11 o'clock. They're by themselves. They have no cell signal. They have no radio signal. They don't have operational control of the border. The cartels do. They can't see the river because the cane is so thick, and they have 2 miles of 72 miles they can navigate. Tell me if anybody in this room or anybody watching would sign up for that job.
So what's it going to take?
It's going to take the willpower again. Go back to guideposts. Stop getting all wrapped around the axle about walls or not walls. We need to build the wall and the fence. Yes. Why? Because physical barriers work. Southern California in the mid-1990s, 600,000+ apprehensions a year. How many apprehensions a year now in Southern California? About 30,000. The triple layer fencing put in place worked. Now let's come to Texas, put fencing where it's needed, and then keep working it up. Now, if a rancher needs access to the Rio Grande, open up a hole, have cameras, and have a Border Patrol agent manning it, and have a road where Border Patrol can get there, but the rancher can have cattle guards.
So if the issue is not simply the wall, you get elected to Congress, will you tell the president to stop making it all about the wall? Because that's what he seems to be doing.
But the president, in making it about the wall, is making it a central issue, and that is politically, I think, a smart thing to do.
You think that's the right thing to do?
I think that what he has done is he's crystallized it for people. Because what happens in Washington is they hide behind the excuses. That is, in Texas, well, we've got Big Bend. We don't want a wall in Big Bend.
Right. Well, that there's the terrain that makes it impossible to actually
or they'll hide behind ranchers. Like, I'm not sure I want a wall blazing through Big Bend. It's a beautiful part of the world. But I do want operational control of the border.
Got it.
So let's start in Brownsville and start working up the border. It's just common sense. If you turned it over to 100 Texans and said, solve the problem, we'd solve the problem. This is what we do as Texans.
Better than Congress would.
It's like the old adage of Bill Buckley saying he'd rather be governed by the first 435 people on the phone.
I keep wondering why you want to go to Congress.
Well, and what did I say? Want is different than calling.
Why are we allowing Saudi Arabia to bat us around like a kitten with a ball of yarn on Jamal Khashoggi? Isn't that what's going on here? I hear you say the United States stands up to her enemies. We don't seem to be standing up, in this case, to our enemy. This was a resident of our country who the president of Turkey acknowledged overnight was murdered. He laid out the whole thing tonight. Why are we playing footsie with the Saudis?
Last night, you're saying?
Yes.
I've not seen that.
No, you should know. Yeah. The President Erdogan actually overnight laid out the entire thing, gave a speech, confirmed that Khashoggi was brutally murdered. Why are we playing footsie with someone who killed an American resident? Why are we not being tougher?
Well, in full disclosure on this one, I've been hard on the campaign trail the last 2 weeks, so this is an issue.
You can hardly not have heard about this.
Well, no, but this is an issue, though. I have not focused on the level I might otherwise, and I also believe that it is typical of politicians to speak first without having thought through what they're going to say, and be knowledgeable about it and informed. I would like to be informed about it. What I know is that it is hardly surprising that a regime like Saudi Arabia might got to look at the facts, might engage in this kind of activity. That shouldn't surprise anybody. This is one of the reasons why we have all been working towards.
So if they did it, what should our response be?
I'm not sure. I think we should obviously have a strong response in a broad diplomatic sense. I think we ought to be continuing to make it clear that the United States stands up for freedom and making sure that we're going to stand behind people that are out there in the Middle East and suffering under these regimes. But look, here's what's important though, right? Is there are massive, broad implications of what we're dealing with in the Middle East policy-wise. I think what we're doing in a broad sense, beyond this one case, in pushing back on Iran, I think is extremely important in terms of what we're seeing in the Middle East right now. I think continuing to stand behind Israel, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, standing behind Israel. These are very important things and critically important. As you know, my previous boss, Governor Perry, Secretary Perry, what we're seeing now in terms of the geopolitical shifts because of energy, because of this state, because of fracking, because of clean burning natural gas, because of LNG exports going to Eastern Bloc, European Bloc countries, going around the world, is dramatically changing the power structures so that we are less reliant on Middle Eastern oil. That is critically important to be able to fill in and answer questions like this. But I'm not going to speak to what exactly our solutions ought to be with this. We certainly ought to speak up loudly against this kind of brutality, however it occurred, at whomever's hands it occurred. We should speak up loudly about that. Do you think what that should mean in terms of policy, I'm not sure.
Do you think, I mean, again, I'm not a believer in the United States of whataboutism. But do you believe that if 6 years ago a similar thing had happened and President Obama's response was what the president's response has been today, that Republicans would be standing for it?
Well, I mean, we had plenty of data points from judgment calls by the previous president.
I mean, this is my point.
That we
know the
certainly
answer.
could see some of the failures, and we saw the failures in Libya. We saw the failures in the way that he approached Iran.
I mean, I just worry that there's a principle above party or who's in the White House where if somebody who's an American resident is killed in a foreign country as brutally and apparently as, wantonly as this happened, why we're not more strong in our response.
As I understand the facts, it is horrific and it should be obviously roundly criticized by all. I think the question is looking at the facts, what does that then mean in terms of our diplomatic and in terms of our foreign policy stances? I have not looked at it enough to tell you what I think those ought to be.
Fair.
I think anybody in the White House ought to be held to account by Congress. But it is important, and I hope that you understand where I'm coming from on this. You've got to go look at the facts, and if you're going to stand up as a member of the Article I Congress, you got to go look at it and say, well, here's the position I'm going to take on this. I feel that way about impeachment, by the way, right? We should look objectively at impeachment based on whether it's a high crime or misdemeanor and then make a call as a grand jury would.
Yeah, you just actually transitioned perfectly to the next thing I want to ask you.
I'm very good at that.
You're a former federal prosecutor. Do you share the view of those in Congress, some in Congress, that the Justice Department has run amok and that the Mueller investigation is not legitimate?
I do believe that the Justice Department clearly has not been operating the way it should in order to create the kind of confidence we need to have in the Department of Justice. It's an important agency. I was proud to be a federal prosecutor. I was, of course, a prosecutor in 2009-10. It was the Eric Holder Department of Justice. Not exactly a place for a strong conservative.
When you talk about your former bosses, you only talk about Cruz and Paxton. You don't mention Eric Holder.
Well, technically, of course, but technically, I was an employee of Fannin County, Texas, because I was through a grant under Project Safe Neighborhood.
Technically, we were your boss.
That's right.
You want to be honest about it.
That's right. So, look, here's what I believe. I believe that these things have a way of, if you follow the truth, okay, wherever it may lead, if you're a prosecutor and you're looking at it and you're trying to execute, this will unfold the way it should. We need to continue to look at it, no matter who's in power. The Department of Justice needs to be objective, whether it's running the FBI, whether you're talking about in court, whatever it's doing with civil rights, whatever the Department of Justice is doing, we need to be able to believe in it, and we need to be able to trust it.
Do you believe in this Department of Justice?
I believe that the current Attorney General has been making changes that needed to occur at the Department of Justice, and that it's heading in the right direction.
Is Mueller legit? Is Mueller legit?
I think that Mueller is I would allow Mueller to continue the investigation and keep doing what's going on. However, he sees fit according to the Department of, according to the interest of those that are overseeing it in Congress. In other words, if Congress is looking at it and thinking that it's legit, great. I've not studied what my hope-to-be colleagues have studied, and that's important. You've got to sit behind in a committee and look at what you've got evidence-wise. I'm not going to make judgments on this in the press. I'm not going to make judgments on this based on what I see in reports.
Right, but you know that one concern is that after the election, the president might change horses at the top of the Justice Department, and that the consequence of that may be that the Mueller investigation is shut down. Would you support that?
I'd have to look at the facts before me to know whether or not the investigation is following the right procedures and is investigated what needs to be investigated. I honestly don't know, because I'm not seeing what others are seeing. And I've done enough prosecuting to know that the facts in front of you that are being reported aren't always the facts you have when you're sitting looking at the report, looking at what the FBI has given you, looking at the stuff that some of which can be public, some of which can't. And I think that's all important. Look, bottom line is, we're a country where if we follow the truth and we go out and do it, whether it's your all's job in the press to report stuff so that people can decide publicly, or whether it's an investigation, we should follow the truth wherever it may lead. I believe that. But that's the game. We shouldn't have witch hunts, but we should also have an environment where the law is being followed and the truth is being pursued.
Yeah, I want to be sure we take a question or two from the audience, but before we do, is Ted Cruz beautiful?
That is a phrase that would never come off of my lips.
Please tell me we got that. Okay. Sir.
Yes. Your predecessor, Lamar... Oh, I'm sorry. Your predecessor, Lamar Smith, was basically a climate change denier. And yet we know that sea level rise has already cost the military hundreds of millions of dollars and will in the next 20 to 30 years cost billions. 100-year storms such as hurricanes and typhoons come about every 10 years now, and this is increasing a massive amount in our disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, which will be billions. What are your thoughts on dealing with this issue that today we're dealing with right here in Austin with our boil water because of these massive rain bombs?
Do you accept the premise that Lamar Smith was a climate change denier?
I've never looked at exactly everything that Congressman Smith has said or not said. I know he's often called a climate change denier, and I've not looked at everything he's done. I do think that Lamar Smith was appropriately trying to focus on what he viewed as an objective view at science, whatever committee he was on, and trying to make good decisions about what's in the best interest of our state and our society, and not accepting necessarily the climate change hysteria, if you want to be sort of saying on the other side of that argument. My belief on this is it's impossible to say that 7 billion people on the planet, or whatever we're up to now, 7 point whatever, aren't having some impact on the environment, right? Of course 7 billion people are having an impact on the environment. So that's not the right question. The right question is what impact are we having relative to other impacts, global, whatever's going on in the solar system, and how close we are to the planet, sun, and different things over history that has caused climate change in the world, and to understand that the best thing we have as people to deal with climate change, which by the way occurs every single day regardless of man's influence, right? We live in climate change when you have seasons change, right? I mean, climate change, the best way to deal with that is by affordable, abundant energy that has transformed our ability to manage this world and to live in it. We live in the ability to have people go to hospitals that are fully powered up to have clean water as a rule. Obviously, we're dealing with that here in Austin right now, but the difference between the billion people that in this world today don't have access to that kind of energy, don't have access to the benefits you get in terms of life expectancy and all of the improvements we've had in this world, because look at what has happened over the last 150 years, since the mid-19th century, and the availability of abundant, affordable energy. And look at what that's meant for life expectancy and the benefits we have in this world. So I believe we ought to continue to do what Texas has been doing, which is to drive forward through innovation, all of the above. We're #1 in wind in the nation, but we've got a clean burning gas that is abundant. We're exporting around the world. Our CO2 is going down 20%, 25%. Get that to India and China. Get that to the rest of the world and see what we're going to be able to do with that great, clean burning, affordable energy, and watch what the world is able to do on questions of things like climate change.
It's a little bit past 9. I know we started late, but I also know that you need to get to San Antonio.
I'll do one more question if you want to get another one. I don't want to cut you all short, but I do need to.
No, it's okay. Question?
apparently I've answered all the questions.
Well, you answered all my questions, which is really all I care about, actually. So, Chip, thank you so much for being
Evan,
here.
thank you so much.
Good luck on the last 14 days.
Appreciate what y'all do.
All right,
Appreciate
thanks
it.
so much.
Thank you.
all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for making time for us.
No.